Welcome to In the Word, your weekday worship guide provided for you here by Ada Christian Reformed Church. My name is Jacob Toman, and I'm the lead pastor at Ada CRC, and I'm delighted to be here with you today talking about Genesis 11 through 15. Those are the chapters that we're going to be reading throughout this week. A brief reminder to use these questions to help your weekday worship reading. Each day, ask these questions about the passage that you are studying. And that doesn't mean that you have to sit down and knock out all 5 of these questions in a single individual session. You can be thinking about these questions throughout the day after you've read the chapter that you're considering that day. So the 5 questions, by a brief reminder, are: what does this passage have to say about God? What does this passage have to say about humanity? How does this passage fit into the bigger picture of the book that we're reading so far? What is strange, offensive, or challenging in this passage? And based on this passage, what would God say is good or not good for my life? In other words, how does God want me to live as a result of this passage? Have you ever walked into a room to get something and then completely forgotten why you went into the room? Our readings this week from Genesis can be a bit confusing at first, almost like walking into a room and forgetting why we went in there in the first place. The first 11 chapters of Genesis focus on some key events that take place over the course of several generations. Huge questions about the universe and our place in it have been answered already through the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But now, after chapter 11, after the Tower of Babel, a genealogy signals another shift in the flow of Genesis. While we have seen the great epochs of Adam in Genesis 1 through 5, of Noah in Genesis 6 through 10, and the people of the plains in Genesis 11, we now focus on a more day-to-day life of one particular family, the family of Abram. Throughout our readings this week, we will learn about the scattering of humanity after Babel in Genesis 11, Abram's faith in Genesis 12 verses 1 through 9, Abram's fright in Genesis 12 verses 10 through 20, Abram's family and land in Genesis 13, the surrounding kingdoms around Abram in Genesis 14, and God's covenant with Abram in Genesis 15. Some Christians throughout history have commented that Genesis could be broken into 2 big sections. The first big section would be the first 11 chapters of Genesis. These first 11 chapters we've read set the broad scene for God's grace in creation. The second big section are the last 38 chapters of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50. This section sets a context through the specific people God used to reveal his grace. The final chapter we will read this week, Genesis 15, gives an important scene that helps us understand God's work and character throughout the entire rest of the Bible. God makes a covenant with Abram. A covenant has been described by one theologian as a 3-legged race, where 2 people tie their legs together and move together, win together, or lose together. When God made his covenant with Abram, Abram fell asleep, and God himself passed through the pieces of animals to sign on the dotted line for both parties this covenant agreement, that God himself would accomplish the promises that were made in the covenant. What Abram could not do in his own ability or strength or spirituality, God promised to fulfill. God had promised way back in Genesis 3 to send an offspring born of the woman who would crush the serpent. God reveals in Genesis 15 that his crushing of the serpent would include a place to call home, a land, and a legacy of children more numerous than the stars. By faith, we are included in that promise. We are the children through faith in Jesus Christ. When we read Genesis 11 through 15, we aren't just reading about any family. For those who believe in Jesus, we are reading about the family of God that we, by God's grace, have been adopted into. More next week about God's work in the midst of the troubles and the trials of this family as we read next week, Genesis 16 through 20. Enjoy your reading this week, and if you have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out pastorjacob@adacrc.org.